In the quiet decades of mid-century America, classrooms were places of order, routine, and unquestioned authority. Chalk dust floated in the air, wooden desks creaked under restless children, and the teacher's voice was law. But on certain days, learning did not come from books or blackboards. It came from a humming projector wheeled into the room, its metal body cold and heavy with reels that promised a lesson no student would forget. When the lights went off, childhood safety ended. The films were introduced as tools of protection. Teachers spoke in calm, serious tones, explaining that what students were about to see was important, necessary, and for their own good. There were no warnings, no permissions, and no escape. The door was shut, curtains were drawn, the projector flickered to life, casting shadows that trembled across young faces. What followed was not education as children knew it, it was confrontation with death. On the screen appeared everyday American scenes, factories, roads, farms, schoolyards. They looked familiar, almost comforting. Then the accidents began, a hand crushed in machinery, a body flung from a car, a worker electrocuted in graphic detail. These were not dramatizations. Many were real, filmed without mercy, lingering on blood, broken bones, and lifeless eyes. Silence filled the classroom, broken only by the clatter of the projector. The logic behind these films was simple and brutal. Fear saves lives. Educational authorities believed that showing the worst possible outcomes would force obedience, caution, and discipline. Children were expected to absorb terror and transform it into responsibility. There was no consideration for emotional readiness, no discussion afterward. When the film ended, the lights came back on, and class resumed as if nothing irreversible had just happened. Students carried those images home with them. At dinner tables, they went quiet. At night, sleep became a battleground of replaying scenes they could not unsee. Parents often knew nothing. The films were approved by institutions, stamped as official educational material. To question them was to question authority itself, something American schools of that era discouraged strongly. The subjects of these films varied but followed a pattern. Driver's Education was infamous for its gore, showing decapitations, crushed skulls, and bodies twisted inside metal wreckage. Industrial safety films displayed workers screaming or dying slowly after simple mistakes. Even home economics classes included warnings where small household errors ended in fire, mutilation, or death. Ordinary life was framed as a constant threat. What made these films especially disturbing was their tone. There was no dramatic music, no emotional commentary. A calm narrator explained events as blood pooled on the screen. Death was presented as factual, inevitable, and deserved. The message was clear. Make one wrong choice, and this will be you. Children were not encouraged to feel empathy, only fear. Teachers themselves were often uncomfortable. Some turned away during screenings, pretending to organize papers while students stared in horror. Others believed deeply in the method, convinced that a traumatized child was a safer child. Training manuals encouraged strict enforcement, advising teachers not to soften the message or allow discussion that could reduce the film's impact. These films emerged from a post-war America obsessed with order and control. The same society that practiced nuclear drills and taught children to hide under desks from atomic bombs believed that fear was preparation. Survival depended on obedience. Emotional damage was not measured, not discussed, and not recorded. Former students later described the same moment, the first graphic image. The realization that adults were willing to show them death without explanation or comfort. Some cried silently, others stared, frozen, a few laughed nervously, immediately ashamed. No reaction was acceptable. The classroom demanded stillness, and stillness became survival. Unlike horror movies, these films offered no release. There was no villain to defeat, no ending that restored balance. The threat was reality itself. Roads, tools, electricity, fire, everything familiar was reframed as lethal. For some children, the world never felt safe again. Psychologists were rarely consulted. Trauma was not a mainstream concept in education. Nightmares, anxiety, and behavioral changes were dismissed as immaturity. Boys were told to toughen up. Girls were told not to be dramatic. The system did not see damage, it saw compliance. As years passed, these films became a shared secret among generations. Adults would mention them casually, laughing about how crazy school used to be, masking the discomfort beneath nostalgia. The images, however, never faded. They returned in flashes, while driving, working, or watching their own children sit in classrooms. By the late 1970s and 1980s, attitudes slowly began to change. Complaints increased. Parents questioned content. Educational psychology evolved. Fear-based learning came under scrutiny, and many of these films were quietly retired, locked away in storage rooms or destroyed without ceremony. No official apologies were issued. No studies followed up on the long-term effects. The era ended not with acknowledgement, but with silence. The reels stopped spinning, and the classrooms moved on, pretending nothing extraordinary had happened. Yet the legacy remains. It lives in the unease some adults feel during safety briefings, in the instinctive fear triggered by warning videos, in the memory of a darkened room and a screen that showed too much, too soon. These films were meant to save lives, but they also taught children something unintended, that authority could expose them to horror without consent, and that fear was an acceptable substitute for understanding. America rarely discusses this chapter of its educational past. It does not fit neatly into progress narratives or patriotic memory. It is uncomfortable, unsettling, and difficult to justify. The classrooms of that era were not violent places by action, but by imagery. Violence entered quietly, rolled in on metal carts, and left without explanation. For those who lived through it, the lesson was permanent. Education, they learned, could hurt. Not physically, but deeply, invisibly, and for life. The chalk was erased. The desks were replaced. The projectors vanished. But the images stayed. What remains is a question America never fully answered: how much fear is acceptable in the name of education? The generation raised on those reels carries the answer in silence. Because some lessons, once seen, can never be unlearned. And some classrooms taught more about death than life. In forgotten school basements and district storage rooms, some of those film reels still exist, their metal cans rusted and unlabeled. When rediscovered years later, even adults hesitate to watch them. Archivists and historians describe the footage as shocking not just for its gore, but for its intent. These were not accidents caught by chance, they were selected, edited, and approved to be shown to children, deliberately and repeatedly. The narration of those films now sounds almost inhuman, detached, precise, and emotionless. As a man bleeds out on screen, the voice calmly explains what rule was broken. There is no sympathy, no pause. Death is reduced to instruction. Watching them today feels less like education and more like a warning carved into flesh, designed to bypass reason and go straight into fear. Survivors of that era often describe a loss of trust they could never quite name. Teachers, once seen as protectors, became figures capable of exposing them to terror without warning. The classroom, once a place of safety, became unpredictable. That shift followed many students into adulthood, shaping how they responded to authority, instruction, and institutional power. Modern schools teach safety with diagrams, simulations, and discussion. Trauma-informed language replaces threats. Yet the shadow of those earlier methods lingers, a reminder of how easily good intentions can cross into harm. The gore film era stands as proof that education reflects the values of its time, and that fear, once accepted as a tool, can leave scars long after the lesson ends. Reels of blood and chalk dust tell a story America rarely revisits, not because it is forgotten, but because it is remembered too clearly by those who lived it. In darkened classrooms, children learned about danger by watching death unfold frame by frame. The projector shut off, the lights came back on, and school continued. But something had changed forever, etched into memory, where no eraser could ever reach.